Let's start with a word of prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you that we come together as you've commanded, and to lift one another up, to encourage one another through these fearful times, and just reinforce that you are in control, that you have the best interest of your people in mind. And so we pray that you would give us wisdom, help us to be good stewards, and help us to be good servants in our communities, and to help in time of need. And we just thank you and praise you for this time, for your word, and help us to grasp the words that you have for us today. Let everything be done for your honor and for your glory. In Yeshua's name we pray, amen. Okay, so we're going to divert a little bit from the series on the Messianic Gospel, series that Ryan White's been going through. And since Passover season is right around the corner, I thought it would be good to address a very important topic, and it ties into one of the issues that came up, 2,000 years ago, as new believers were starting to come into the assemblies, the Gentile believers, and them wanting to participate in the festivals that God had commanded. But there were some specific things that they were being required to do in order to participate. And so I want to kind of address that. And so the title of this series is called Original Intent. By grace are you saved, not of works, and this is part 1. And so I want to begin in the handout from Ephesians 2, verses 8 through 9, because this is where this phrase comes from. It says, "For by grace are you saved through faith, and not of works, not of yourselves." It is a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. So my question is, what was the original intent that prompted this statement by Paul to the church at Ephesus? We know that these churches were beginning to populate with Gentile believers, and so they were mixing there. The congregations were mixed, Gentiles and Jews. And if you understand the culture of the day, that was a very difficult thing for them to do, to come in contact or be in company with one of another nation, because of the way they understood the laws, the purity laws. And so it was kind of a challenging time. And I think most of you know in the temple that there were different courts, and the courts were designed with fences where only certain people could go beyond certain points. And the Gentiles, it was the outer court. That's as far as they could go. And so it kind of developed into a caste system. So if you were Gentile, you were the lowest in the caste system in terms of coming to the temple. You had to stay at the furthest part. And so this was an issue as the Gentile believers were coming in to the church, and we know that Paul was the minister to the Goyim. Marcel doesn't like the word Gentiles, Goyim of the other nations, and so he had a unique challenge of bringing two groups together in unity and to live according to the Torah. So it was a difficult thing. So was it because, what was the original intent that prompted this statement by Paul? By grace are you saved, not of works. Was it because followers of Messiah in that day believed that keeping the law of Moses, the Torah in its entirety, was what saved a person? Was that their thinking of that day? All right. We know today, when this is quoted to us to defend a position that, well, the law is not important, today there's the mindset that this is applying to the whole of the Torah, the whole, the commandments, and so that's not important. It's by grace you're saved, and we're going to find out that the Torah has always taught you're saved by faith. Okay, we're going to see that. That's not a new concept. So what were they thinking? What was the issue 2,000 years ago? It's not the same thinking that Christian theology has turned into, and I would say this is fairly new. This idea that the keeping of the commandments is turned into, well, you're doing it for works for salvation. 75 years ago, in most Christian churches, they practiced a faith very close to ours today in terms of when it came to honoring a day of rest. If you remember, just 50 years ago, 70 years ago, businesses were shut down on Sunday. Why? It was because those were blue laws. Those were laws established because it was the Christian, in their Christian faith, they believed Sunday was a Sabbath, and you did not work on that day. You did not buy or sell on that day. Because I remember my grandpa, he wouldn't work on Sunday because he believed that was keeping, he was obligated to keep the commandments as he understood them, and he would not work on Sunday. So what I'm saying is this idea that has morphed into, by grace you're saved and not of works, has morphed into this idea, well, that's talking about the Sabbath, that's talking about, a lot of the laws in the Old Testament, and those aren't important anymore. I'm saying that's a fairly new concept. And so what we want to try to do, what was the original intent 2,000 years ago of this statement? In other words, what was the context? And I think you're going to find it quite interesting as we go through this. It becomes very, very clear what their theology and their thinking was of this statement. Okay. So, or was it something very specific? So back to this question. 2,000 years ago, did the followers of Messiah believe that keeping the law of Moses, keeping the Torah as a whole, did they believe that's what saved a person? Or was it something very specific contained in the law of Moses that Paul was addressing that crept into the church as Gentile believers were beginning to swell their ranks? So I propose to you that it was something very specific that Paul was addressing. In fact, I will propose the specific issue he was addressing was a major theme in many of his writings. And that specific issue was circumcision of the flesh. And as I mentioned earlier, as with Passover coming up, this ties in, it's very, very critically to that day, and is what created the problem that Paul had to deal with 2,000 years ago. It dealt with the feast days, okay? Now, many of the debates that I engaged in concerning whether or not we should keep the Torah in part or in whole always seemed to fought over Paul's writings, okay? Specifically, two of his epistles. The two most often quoted books when it comes to defending that the law is not important anymore was the two books that were used most generally was Romans and Galatians, the two main books. And of course it usually started with Ephesians 2 verses 8 and 9, with verse 10 usually being left out, as I did in the opening statement, because verse 10 after Ephesians 2, 8, 9, it says, well, I'll just quote all three verses. For by grace are you saved through faith, and not of yourselves. It is a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. Verse 10, that generally gets left off, says, for we are his workmanship, created in Messiah Yeshua unto good works, which God hath before ordained that we should walk in them. Okay? So it makes it very clear that there's a workmanship of good works that God requires us, not for salvation, okay, but because we have a relationship with him. So verses often used to defend not keeping, the Torah or parts of it, Romans 10:4. For Messiah is the end of the law for righteousness to everyone that believes. Galatians 2:16. Knowing that a man is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith of Yeshua the Messiah. Even we have believed in Yeshua the Messiah that we might be justified by the faith of Messiah, and not by the works of the law, for by the works of the law shall no flesh be justified. Galatians 3:10, for as many as are of the works of the law are under the curse, for it is written, cursed is everyone that continueth not in all things which are written in the book of the law to do them. So, as I mentioned earlier, I proposed that the specific issue he was addressing, that Paul was addressing, was a major theme in many of his writings, and that specific issue was circumcision of the flesh. So this issue was addressed before Paul's missionary journeys and the writings of his epistles. And we will look at that timeline after we review the specific issue of circumcision, and that it is a pattern throughout many of Paul's epistles. So, does anybody have any questions so far? And especially concerning the idea, original intent. What was Paul's original intent with his statement, by grace are you saved, not of works? Because today, that intent is used to defend or do away with the Torah, okay? Was that Paul's original intent? Any comments or questions before we go on? Okay, yes.
Okay, so the original intent being circumcision of the flesh, can you put that as a body as a whole? Do we look at that as circumcision in the flesh, not just the foreskin, but in our strength, as verse to circumcision of the heart? Because he says, doesn't he say that he wants our hearts circumcised, not our flesh?
Correct. So we're going to, when I say circumcision of the flesh, I'm using that term to specifically reference the very act of removing the foreskin, as was commanded in the Torah. Now there's analogies used with that, being circumcised in the flesh. There's also the circumcision that is not in the flesh; it's in the heart. Okay, and that's what we're going to see makes a big difference. But we still need to ask the question, the term that Paul used, by grace are you saved, not of works, is that a broad statement for concerning all works or all things, in the Torah, or did he use that statement to address a very specific issue in the Torah? And that's what I'm proposing. And as we go through, this could take 3 or 4 weeks to get through it all. But you're going to see the evidence as we go through all the scriptures, and it'll be, it's pretty profound. Okay, any other questions before we go on? Okay, so we're going to start with Acts 15, and we're going to read 1 through 31. This was the specific issue, circumcision of the flesh in order to be saved. And certain men which came down from Judea taught the brethren, and said, except ye be circumcised after the manner of Moses, you cannot be saved. Okay, so there was these men that came down and said, hey, and why did these men bring this up? Why at this time? Because there were many Gentiles coming to faith in Messiah, and they're congregating, on Shabbat in the synagogues, and so now they had this mix beginning to really change their percentages of Jews and Greeks, and they began to dominate in a lot of the assemblies. They became probably more of them than the Jews, and so these men brought this issue up. Said, hey, they need to be circumcised in order to be saved. Was circumcision an issue among the Jews? Was that an issue, or were they doing circumcision? The evidence supports that the Jews were still, getting circumcised according to the law. So the issue was for the Gentiles. Okay. So verse 2. When therefore Paul and Barnabas had no more small dissension and disputation with them, they determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain other of them should go up to Jerusalem and unto the apostles and elders about this question. And being brought on their way by the church, they passed through Phoenice and Samaria, declaring the conversion of the Gentiles, or Goyim, and they caused great joy unto all brethren. And when they were come to Jerusalem, they were received of the church and of the apostles and elders, and declared all things that God had done with them. But there rose up a certain of the sect of the Pharisees, which believed, saying that it was needful to circumcise them and command them to keep the law of Moses. Now, I want to make a point here. Now, when he says that, what's the issue? Are we talking about a lot of different things in the Torah, or are we talking about one specific thing? We're talking about one very specific thing. And we're talking about one very specific thing contained in what? The law of Moses. So when we see this term, the law of Moses, we have to include the context there, because often when that term is used, everything gets lumped in, all the laws get lumped into that statement, that that's what's being talked about. No, we're talking about the circumcision, which is contained in the law of Moses. So I just want to make that point. And think about that as we see this term come up later. And the apostles and elders came together to consider this matter, and when there had been much disputing, Peter rose up and said unto them, Men and brethren, ye know how that a good while ago God made choice among us, that the Gentiles by my mouth should hear the word of the gospel and believe. And God, which knows their hearts, bare them witness, giving them the Holy Spirit, even as he did unto us. And he put no difference between us and them, purifying their hearts by faith. So now why therefore tempt ye God to put a yoke upon the neck of the disciples, which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear? Now, I want to make a point here, several points. So Peter's making a case here that, hey, look at the evidence of the Holy Spirit working in the Gentiles, okay? And I'm sure Peter told them about the event in Acts chapter 9 and 10, where Peter had a vision, he went under Cornelius. So they knew all this, okay? And, Peter made the conclusion that God has showed me not to call any man common or unclean, but he that does the righteousness, who does the righteousness of God, he shall be accepted. Okay, I paraphrased that. So the Gentiles were still required to do the righteousness of God, okay? But one of the things that was not necessary that they're disputing here is one thing contained in the Torah, and that was circumcision, okay? Now, we're going to get into the reasons. Well, it was in the Torah, then why aren't they required? Well, we're going to get into that. It's going to be toward the end of this series, but there's a very specific reason why. Okay, now, so it's the evidence here is that God put no difference between the Jews and the Goyim, the Gentiles, purifying their hearts by faith. And remember, faith, our hearts have always been purified by faith. The Torah says, the just shall live by faith. Okay, that's not a new thing. So, now therefore, why do you tempt God to put a yoke upon the neck of the disciples which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear? Now, what yoke were they not able to bear? Following the law perfectly. So that's, you're looking at it as the whole, right? The whole of the Torah, okay. And it could be, that is true. They had trouble with lots of elements there. But we're talking about one specific issue, so why would, so Paul says it's a yoke that we didn't even. So do you know that when they came out of Egypt, they were all circumcised. All the males were circumcised when they came out of Egypt. That's in Joshua 5, okay. But during their wilderness journey for 40 years, they did not circumcise their children. So when they entered into the promised land, when they crossed the Jordan, before they took Jericho, God commanded, actually, this is another interesting story. An angel, they said, it used a different term there. I can't remember the term, but this individual appeared before Joshua, and he fell down, and he had a flaming sword. Okay, and it wasn't, Seth, you remember, what was the term he used? It wasn't an angel, it was not the master or the sergeant. It was, I can't remember. It was an army term, if I remember right. The captain. The captain, thank you. Okay. And then a few verses later it says, and Yahweh said to him. So this captain of the host of the army. Remember who went before Israel and who in the fire and the cloud? We determined that was Yeshua. Okay. And so anyway, the captain tells them that you need to circumcise children. So what Peter was referencing there, the yoke that they couldn't bear, they didn't bear their fathers. They didn't even circumcise for that time period. So they weren't perfect, okay? So that's why he made that point. It could include, go beyond that, but we know it specifically includes the circumcision of their children as they were wandering in the wilderness. Well, the adults coming out of Egypt were already circumcised, and then the adults over 20 died off before they entered into the land. So what did that leave? The children from those adults. The adults did not circumcise their children. And and this is a point we need to consider too. Did the children have any choice in being circumcised at the proper time? No. It was the responsibility of the father to make sure, the parents to make sure they were circumcised. So that's another thing to consider. All right, so let's carry on. Does anybody have any questions? Mark.
Okay, they were spread out too back then. And a yoke too would be animal sacrificing. If you really, really want to do it, you would have to go back to Jerusalem and have all this burden. And it mentions the nations, the word's going out into the nations. So with circumcision and animal sacrificing in the temple and all that all kind of goes together.
Yeah, that's one thought. Okay, so as we continue to go through all the scriptures, we're going to see, what all fits, and you're going to find it very interesting. So, verse 11, Acts 15. But we believe that through the grace of the Lord Yeshua Messiah, we shall be saved, even as they. Then all the multitude kept silence and gave audience to Barnabas and Paul, declaring what miracles and wonders God had wrought among the Gentiles by them. And after they had held their peace, James answered, saying, Men and brethren, hearken unto me. For Simeon hath declared how God at first did visit the Gentiles to take out of them a people for his name. And to this agree the words of the prophets. And this is written, After this I will return and will build again the tabernacle of David, which is fallen down. And I will again build the ruins thereof, and I will set it up. That the residue of men might seek after the Lord, and all the Gentiles upon whom my name is called, saith the Lord, who doeth all these things. Known unto God are all his works from the beginning of the world. Wherefore my sentence is this, that we trouble not them which from among the Gentiles are turned to God, but that we write unto them that they should abstain from pollutions of idols, from fornication, things strangled, and from blood. For Moses of old hath in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath day. Then pleased it the apostles and elders with the whole church to send chosen men of their own company to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, namely Judas, surnamed Barsabas, and Silas, chief men among the brethren. And they wrote letters by them after this manner. The apostles and the elders and brethren, and greetings unto the brethren which are of the Gentiles in Antioch and Syria and Cilicia. For as much as we have heard that certain which went out from us have troubled you with words, subverting your souls, saying, Ye must be circumcised and keep the law, to whom gave no such commandment. So it seemed good unto us, being assembled with one accord, to send chosen men unto you with our beloved Barnabas and Paul, for men that have hazarded their lives for the name of the Lord Yeshua the Messiah. We have sent therefore Judas and Silas, who shall also tell you the same things by mouth. Page 3 of your handout. For it seemed good to the Holy Spirit and to us to lay upon you no greater burden than these necessary things, that ye abstain from meats offered to idols, from blood and things strangled, and from fornication, from which if ye keep yourselves, you shall do well. Fare ye well. So when they were dismissed, they came to Antioch, and when they had gathered the multitude together, they delivered the epistle, which when they had read, they rejoiced for the consolation. Okay, so the specific issue being addressed. There were certain that believed, from a certain sect of the Pharisees, that the Gentiles must be circumcised in order to be saved. Their conclusion was, no, they do not have to be physically circumcised to be saved, for they are saved through faith. And so, when in verse 24, it says, for as much as you've heard that certain went out from us have troubled you with words, subverting your soul, saying, ye must be circumcised and keep the law, to whom we gave no... So the circumcision is a specific issue, not the whole law. It's the circumcision contained in the law, in the Torah. Is it, you seeing that? Because why would it go on to pick out 4 specific things that they were commanded to observe? From meat strangled, from blood, from fornication, and there was one other thing here. Pardon? And pollution of idols, okay. Which those are contained in the Torah. So by deduction, he wasn't, when he says that they did not have to, that they must be circumcised and keep the law, it wasn't referring to circumcision and the whole law. It was referring to circumcision in the law. So I want to make that point. Okay. So they put this in a letter and they sent it out and to the churches. Now I wanted, but on the screen there and in your handout is a timetable and events of Paul's life. And so this is kind of critical here. We see that in 37 AD, Paul's conversion on his way to Damascus. 40 AD, Paul's journey back to Jerusalem. 41 AD, I threw this in, this is Peter's vision and meeting with Cornelius. 40 to 45 AD, Paul journeys back to Tarsus. 46 to 49, Paul's first missionary journey. 50 AD, Paul and Barnabas and other brethren are summoned to Jerusalem to address the issue, except ye be circumcised after the law, after the manner of Moses, you cannot be saved. 50 to 52 AD, Paul goes on a second missionary journey. 53 to 60, Paul goes on a third missionary journey. 53, so the book of Galatians, again I mentioned the two books used to try to say that the law, that the Torah is done away with, is the 2 books, Galatians and Romans typically. That book was written in 53 to 57 AD. Okay, this was how many years after the meeting in Jerusalem? About 3 to 7 years. It's interesting that Galatians, the concentration of the term circumcision or uncircumcision, the concentration of that term is most significant in the book of Galatians. Okay. So I mentioned, it's mentioned 13 times and uncircumcision 3 times. Then in 57 AD, the book of Romans was written by Paul. It mentions circumcision 16 times and uncircumcision 8 times. The book of Philippians, written in 60 to 62 AD, mentions circumcision 2 times. The book of Colossians, written in 62 AD, mentions circumcision 5 times and uncircumcision 2 times. 60 to 65 AD, the book of Ephesians was written, mentions circumcision 1 time and uncircumcision 1 time. And then in 67 AD, Paul was beheaded. So there's a theme here that I want you to see, all right, that will help us understand the original intent. By grace are you saved, not of works. The pattern of the issue of circumcision mentioned in many of Paul's letters leads us to the question, was this the underlying original intent of the reason for Paul focusing on the concept of saved by grace and not of works? Before we get to the book of Galatians, we need to set a premise with the main verses concerning grace and works. So we started in Ephesians chapter 2. I know I got started late. How much time do you want me to go? It's Marcel? Okay. All right. So, Ephesians 2:8, the famous verse. For by grace are you saved through faith and not of yourselves. It is a gift of God. This is a true statement, right? It's a true statement. But what prompted Paul to make that statement? Not of works, lest any man should boast. Now, there's a reference to this exact same phrase in Romans 3, which we're going to go to in a little bit, okay? Not of works, lest any man should boast. So I want you to keep this in the back of your mind. For we are his workmanship, created in Messiah Yeshua unto good works. What good works are those? Which ones are ordained? Which works? You know, give me a visual. Give me a. Fruits of the Spirit. Yeshua said, "Let your good works, let your light shine before all men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven." So there are good works that we're ordained to do. Okay. And again, it's not because we're trying to earn this works. Earning your salvation through works, the way it's taught is, I tell you, it's a fairly new, I would say, within the last century. Now there were elements of that thinking, 2,000 years ago, but it was with a very specific issue. Okay, a very specific issue. It wasn't to the level that it has been turned into in the last 100 years. So, Ephesians chapter 2. Let's go ahead and read the rest of the chapter. For context, okay? Wherefore remember that you, being in time past Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision, by that which is called circumcision in the flesh made by hands. So do you think there was an issue between the uncircumcision and the circumcision? Between the Jews and the Gentiles, was there an issue? Does that kind of give some indication the original intent of his statement then? By grace are you saved, not of works? That at that time ye were without Messiah, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope, and without God in the world. But now in Messiah Yeshua, ye who sometimes were far off are made nigh by the blood of the Messiah. For he is our peace, who hath made both one. Now who's both? Who's he talking about? How he is? Okay, that's how I understand it. And hath broken down the middle wall of partition between us. So was there a wall between them? Okay, what was that wall? Let's talk about what was that physical wall.
The gate between the courts.
That's a good visual there. There was. Okay. That was an ordained gate, I think, by the way. Maybe it was. They had to protect the different minutiae of the temple. There's another wall. There's another wall that was built. It wasn't a physical wall. Yeah, that played into it. Yeah, and what was one of those traditions? Exactly. When we decide, Rhonda, I don't want to have anything to do with you. What did I just do? I built a wall. Okay. I could use anybody, Seth, huh? Seth or Mark, I don't want to have anything to do with you. We've built a wall. Okay. So it's not a physical wall, but it acts like one because it keeps us from coming together. So that's what the Jews had done. Okay. Got a comment over here, Scott.
It's actually, the wall that you're referring to is actually a much worse wall than the material wall because it divided God's people.
Yeah.
And it hardened people's hearts.
Yeah, it did. The very thing Israel was created to do, to be a light to the nations, they turned it into a very selfish mission. It was all about them. Okay. And they built this caste system. And that wasn't, that's what happens when men take over.
Wouldn't there be an example in Scripture of that very thing, that barrier? The man had fallen and was beaten up, and wasn't there two priests that were walking by and just walked on by?
Yeah.
And then the Samaritan went down and tended. That was because of that wall that was...
Yeah. And the man that was beaten, didn't it not say that he was naked? So do you think those priests knew that he wasn't a Jew? It's weird, but I mean, that's how they determined who they were going to be friends with and who they weren't. Okay. He wasn't circumcised, so they said, I won't. The law was unlawful for a man that is Jew to keep company with one of another nation. This was the very wall that God had to show Peter, you need to tear that down because I never created that wall. You did. Okay.
And in their very ignorance, what they fail to realize is this. At the time of the Exodus from Egypt, a mixed multitude went out with them,
Yeah.
which is us.
Yeah. A mixed multitude, absolutely. In fact, since you mentioned that, what were the plagues, the purpose of the plagues designed to do? God's hope was that through these plagues, because each plague was designed in a way to show the Egyptians that the gods that they served were no gods at all. Because every plague dealt with the frogs, the god. All these were gods. So he was mentally trying to show them, theologically, that, because he said that when he went out, they went out in the sight of all Egypt, and he said that they would know that I alone am Yahweh. His whole purpose was, his heart is that no one would perish. For it's God's will that no man perish, but all that would come to the knowledge. Okay, so his desire was for Egypt to turn, and he used every one of their gods, and as an example, using the plagues to try to get them. And many, it's obvious, I believe, many went out with Israel. Okay, so it did change. So anyway, so this wall then, he had broken down that middle wall of partition, having abolished in his flesh the enmity. Now what is enmity? Hatred. So what did he abolish? The law. Because the very next verse says, the law of commandments. It said he abolished the enmity, even the law of commandments. So there must have been laws that produced this enmity. Okay. In ordinances. Okay. For to make in himself of two one new man in making peace. So the ordinances I mentioned it's in Romans, I think it's 10:45, if I'm not mistaken. But that wall, those ordinances that no man that is a Jew could come in contact with one of another nation, that was a law, that was an ordinance. Okay, and it created enmity. that he might reconcile both unto God in one body by the cross, having slain the enmity thereby. And he came and preached peace to you which were far off, and to them that were nigh. For through him we both have access by one Spirit unto the Father. Now therefore ye are no more strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens and saints in the household of God, and are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Yeshua the Messiah himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom all the building fitly framed together groweth unto a holy temple in the Lord, in whom ye are also builded together for a habitation of God through the Spirit. So this is the context of Ephesians chapter 2 that says, for by grace are you saved, not of yourselves, not of works, lest any man should boast. This is the context. It brings in, this enmity between the uncircumcised and the circumcised, okay? And, so, how did they go wrong? How did they come to this idea that if you weren't circumcised, we can't have anything to do with you? They had a legitimate reason. It comes from Exodus 12, verses starting, I think, in verse 40, and we're going to get to that, okay? But before we get to that, we're going to go through all these terms that have been used to say the law's been done away with. We're going to find this connection of circumcision of the flesh to every one of those. Okay, so I did go over. I did want the next group of verses is in Romans 3, the whole chapter. But I want to mention just a couple verses, and we'll close here. So in Ephesians, where I read verse 9, chapter 2, verse 9, for not of works, lest any man should boast. Remember, we read, for by grace you are saved through faith, and not of yourselves, it is a gift of God, not of works, lest any man should boast. Let's go to Romans 3:27. It's on page 5, and it says, if I can find page 5, do we? Yeah, it's on page 5. Where is boasting then? It is excluded. By what law? Of works? No, but the law of faith. Okay, so this phrase, boasting, it has this interesting connection to a certain particular law that built the Jewish people up and made them feel proud and privileged. They felt just because they were children of Abraham, they were of the circumcision, that they had special privileges, whether they followed God's laws of loving your neighbor as yourself or not. They believed they had a ticket into the kingdom because they were circumcised children of Abraham. They believed that. That was their mindset for many of them. So this is the mindset that Paul's trying to break, because many Gentiles were becoming partakers of the blessings of Abraham and the promises of Abraham that were mentioned to Abraham. Okay? So boasting, where's boasting? It's excluded by what law? Of works? No, but the law of faith. When did the law of faith come into play? Way back then, in Abraham, and even before then. Okay, so, and then the first verse of Romans 3 give you a context again. What advantage then hath the Jew? We haven't read Romans 2, which gets really detailed on the topic. So I'll just start in Romans 3 here, and I'll read verse 1. So what advantage then hath the Jew? Or what profit is there of circumcision? Okay, so I'm going to have to close, but you're going to see this common thread of circumcision of the flesh in this battle between we're privileged, you're not. To become privileged, there's certain things you need to do to look like us, okay? The connection is very compelling to this concept that we're saved by grace, not of works. Not physical circumcision that they were dealing with in that day, okay? So it can apply to other, to other areas in life, okay? But that whole term was coined, the original intent, because of this one specific issue. Okay, any comments or questions before we close? Mark?
Like for me and Anita, we were thinking, should we circumcise our kids? And I got it wrong because I circumcised right there at the hospital. It was a vitamin K shot. Or if I would do it now, I'd wait until the 8th day. But, it's like Romans 2, 25 says, for circumcision indeed profiteth. So it's a yes there. If law, they'll be practicing. And you go up a couple verses, it says the law is like robbing the temple.
Yeah.
So we know what the law is. And then if I jump to Galatians 5:11 says, I, however, brethren, of circumcision I yet proclaim. And then it goes on to say the stumbling block of the tree. Then verse 5:3 says, yes, I bear solemn witness again unto every man getting circumcised that he is a debtor to do the whole law. So I'm thinking that these children, that you can go way back in the beginning, so they see the sign, and then you can go in your head, see what's going on right now. So anyway.
So to answer your question, should we circumcise our children? Absolutely. The issue, absolutely. The issue is, because they won't know it when it happens, so that's the best time to do it. Okay. The issue is it needful to be circumcised in order to be saved? In Corinthians, Paul mentions that if you're called in circumcision, don't become uncircumcised. If you're called in uncircumcision, don't become circumcised. Now, don't ask me how you come uncircumcised, okay? But I guess there was a practice. Okay. The point isn't, is circumcision, should we do it or not? That's not the question here. The question is circumcision in order to be saved for a group of people that were coming to believe, when they were a lot older. Okay. So anyway, so yes, it's a good thing. All right. Now remember, we have like 3 more weeks of this, so there's going to be a lot of verses and chapters and books we're going to cover.
Okay, so this is Romans 3:21, and then I looked over at Rob's, and he has the scriptures, just because I got NLT. And so 3:21 says, but now God has shown us a way to be made right with him without keeping the requirements of the law. And as promised in the writings of Moses and the prophets long ago, we are made right with God by placing our faith in Jesus Christ. And this is true for everyone who believes, no matter who we are. So then take that same verse, that's the New Living Translation, and then this is the scriptures, Romans 3:21. But now, apart from the Torah, a righteousness of Elohim has been revealed, being witnessed by the Torah and the prophets. And the righteousness of Elohim is through belief in Yahweh Messiah to all and on all who believe, for there is no difference.
Okay, so again, we're going to get into a lot more detail. Okay, I'll read what you just read and then make a final comment. But now, this is in Romans 3:21. But now the righteousness of God without the law is manifested, being witnessed by the law and the prophets. So what does that mean? The righteousness of God without the law is manifested, being witnessed by the law. So this concept was witnessed in the Torah and the prophets. Okay. Okay. And that Deuteronomy 16:20 And it's the concept that Habakkuk, I'll start with Habakkuk 2:4. But behold, his soul which is lifted up is not upright in him, but the just shall live by faith. Okay. Who's justified? Are the hearers or the doers of the law justified? Yeah. Not the hearers of the law are justified, but the doers of the law. Okay, so this concept is you follow Torah, but understand what justifies you is the faith. Okay. Well, yeah, of the promise. So when the promise made to Abraham, he knew that the only way he could be justified was by faith, and that faith it points to the Messiah. Okay. So in Deuteronomy 16:20, that which is altogether just shalt thou follow, that thou mayest live and inherit the land. Okay. You follow what's just. Okay. God will provide the way. That's where that's where faith comes in. You know, they wouldn't have never left bondage, Egypt, if they wouldn't have had the faith to say, let's go. We trust that you're going to do this. So it began. And Paul makes a very compelling point to the Jews who believe circumcision was critical. He said, was Abraham called in circumcision or uncircumcision? Right. He was called in uncircumcision. So Paul makes that point to the brethren that were so stuck on circumcision being a mandate for the Gentiles. So what does that tell us? That Abraham was saved by faith. Okay. But can faith alone save you? As the book of James, can faith alone save you? No. Can works alone save you? Can works alone save you? No. The just shall live by faith. Whole concept. All right. Okay, so we'll